The Duke sent her to wash dishes. Then she revealed she spoke 5 languages and read the stars. The plate slipped from her hand and shattered against the stone floor, and every head in the kitchen turned toward her at once. Myra froze, water dripping from her fingers, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. The head housekeeper, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Whitfield, was already storming toward her, wooden spoon raised like a weapon. "That is the 3rd plate this week," Mrs. Whitfield hissed. "One more mistake, girl, and you will find yourself on the road before nightfall." Myra dropped to her knees and began gathering the broken pieces, her hands shaking, not from fear of the housekeeper, but from exhaustion that had settled so deep into her bones it felt permanent. She had been at Ashford Hall for 11 days. 11 days of scrubbing pots before sunrise, hauling water until her shoulders screamed, and sleeping on a thin mattress in a room she shared with 3 other maids who barely spoke to her. Nobody at Ashford Hall knew who she really was, and she intended to keep it that way. "Sorry, Mrs. Whitfield," Myra said quietly, keeping her eyes down. "It will not happen again." The housekeeper studied her for a long moment, the way a merchant studies a coin she suspects is counterfeit. Something about this new girl did not sit right with her, though she could not say exactly what. The girl's hands were too soft for someone who claimed to have worked in kitchens all her life. Her back stayed too straight when she carried heavy trays. And once, just once, Mrs. Whitfield had caught her reading the spines of books in the library when she thought no one was watching, her lips moving as she read the titles, some of which were not even written in English. "See that it does not," Mrs. Whitfield said finally, and turned on her heel. Myra exhaled and finished gathering the broken plate. Around her, the kitchen returned to its usual chaos, pots clanging, the cook shouting orders, the smell of roasting meat thick in the air. She carried the shattered pieces to the bin near the back door and stepped outside for a moment, just to breathe. The cold evening air hit her face and she closed her eyes. Somewhere beyond the high stone walls of the estate, the sky was beginning to darken, and the first stars were appearing, faint and scattered like scattered salt. She used to know every one of them by name. Her father had taught her, on nights when the world felt too loud and the stars felt like the only honest thing left. That was before everything fell apart, before the debts, before the men who came looking for her family with papers and cold eyes, before she had to disappear into a life so small and so quiet that nobody would think to look for her scrubbing dishes in a duke's kitchen. "You should not be standing out here alone," a voice said behind her. Myra spun around, startled, and found herself looking at a young footman named Peter, a kind-faced boy of perhaps 17, who had been the only person at Ashford Hall to speak to her with any warmth since she arrived. "I just needed some air," she said. Peter glanced around before stepping closer, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Whitfield has it in for you, you know. She thinks you are hiding something." Myra's stomach tightened, but she kept her face calm. "I am just a maid, same as anyone else." Peter did not look convinced, but he let it go. "The Duke returns tomorrow," he said instead. "From London. There will be a great deal of extra work. You should get some rest while you can." The Duke. Myra had not yet laid eyes on him, only heard the servants whisper about him in low, careful tones. Alastair Ashford, they said, was a hard man since the death of his father, cold in his manner, sharp in his judgments, and utterly uninterested in anything that did not concern the estate's finances or its reputation. He had dismissed 3 housekeepers in 2 years for reasons nobody fully understood. "I will," Myra said, though she had no intention of sleeping well. She never did. That night, lying on her thin mattress while the other maids slept around her, Myra stared up at the cracked ceiling and thought about the letter hidden beneath the loose floorboard under her bed. She had read it so many times the creases were beginning to tear. It was the last thing her mother had ever written to her, sent just days before the men came, and everything Myra knew was taken apart piece by piece. She thought about her old life sometimes, the tutors who had come to their house twice a week, the books in 4 different languages stacked in her father's study, the nights on the rooftop with a borrowed telescope, tracing the paths of planets while her father quizzed her on their names in French, then in Italian, then in a language he told her belonged to nobody and everybody, the language of numbers and stars, which did not care what country you came from or what your name used to be. She had been someone once, a daughter with a future. Now she was a maid with broken plates and a secret so heavy it kept her awake most nights. In the morning, the house transformed. Every surface was polished, every rug beaten, every window scrubbed until it gleamed. The cook prepared a feast fit for a returning lord, and the entire staff lined up in the front hall like soldiers awaiting inspection. Myra stood near the back, trying to make herself as small and unremarkable as possible. She had learned over the past 11 days that the safest place to be was invisible. The carriage arrived just past noon, wheels crunching over the gravel drive. Myra watched through the tall windows as a man stepped down, tall, dark-haired, dressed in a traveling coat the color of storm clouds. Even from a distance, there was something commanding about the way he moved, unhurried, certain, as if the entire world had already agreed to wait for him. Alistair Ashford entered the hall, and the staff bowed and curtsied in a wave, like grass bending under wind. Myra bowed her head with the rest of them, careful to keep her eyes on the floor. He passed down the line without much interest, offering brief nods to the housekeeper, a few words to the butler about the state of the accounts, a glance toward the new footman. His gaze slid over Myra the same way it slid over everyone else, without pausing, without curiosity. She told herself that was exactly what she wanted. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Myra woke before dawn, scrubbed pots until her hands were raw, carried trays up and down endless staircases, and fell into bed each night too tired to dream. She kept her head down. She spoke only when spoken to. She made herself as ordinary as the walls around her. But ordinary was hard to maintain. It happened on a rainy afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the Duke's return. Myra had been sent to the study to collect a tray of tea things that had been left there since morning. The room was empty, the fire burned low, and papers were scattered across the great desk in the center of the room, ledgers and letters and columns of figures that clearly did not add up, judging by the frustrated scrawl of ink crossing out entire pages. She should have simply collected the tray and left. That would have been the wise thing to do. Instead, her eyes caught on the open ledger, and before she could stop herself, she was reading it. Not the way a maid reads, glancing without understanding, but the way she had been trained to read, quickly, completely, numbers arranging themselves into patterns in her mind the way music arranges itself into melody. Something was wrong with the accounts. A column that should have balanced did not. Money that had come in from the eastern farms was not matching the money that had gone out for their upkeep, and the difference was not small. It was a difference that, over several years, would add up to a fortune. Myra's fingers itched for a pen before she caught herself. This was not her business. This was not her house, not her fortune, not her problem to solve. She set down the tray she had come to collect, gathered the empty cups instead, and turned to leave. The door opened before she reached it. The Duke stood in the doorway, rein still clinging to his shoulders from wherever he had been outside, his expression unreadable. For a moment neither of them moved. "You are in my study," he said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man who rarely had to ask questions twice. "I came for the tea things, my lord," Myra said, keeping her voice steady, her eyes lowered. "I am sorry for the intrusion." He glanced past her toward the desk, toward the open ledger, and something in his gaze sharpened. "Did you touch my papers?" "No, my lord." That much at least was true. She had not touched them. She had only read them, which felt in that moment like a far greater crime. He studied her for a long beat, the same way Mrs. Whitfield had studied her that first week, as though trying to place a face he had seen somewhere before and could not remember where. Myra held perfectly still, willing herself to look like nothing more than a tired kitchen maid eager to finish her chores and disappear. "You may go," he said finally. She did not need to be told twice. She slipped past him, tray balanced carefully, and did not breathe properly again until she was 3 hallways away. That night she lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, replaying the numbers in her head without meaning to. The mismatch nagged at her like an unfinished sentence. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she was here to disappear, not to be noticed, and certainly not to go poking through a duke's private accounts like some kind of clerk. But some habits, it seemed, could not be scrubbed away no matter how many pots she washed. 3 days later, the steward of the estate, a narrow, watchful man named Edmund Gray, called an unexpected meeting of the household staff in the servants' hall. He announced, in a voice that tried too hard to sound casual, that there had been some irregularities discovered in the estate's bookkeeping, and that everyone should be prepared to answer questions if asked. Myra sat very still through the entire announcement, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully blank. She noticed, though she was careful not to let it show, that Edmund Gray's eyes swept the room and lingered just briefly on her. It was nothing, a coincidence. She told herself that all the way back to the kitchen, scrubbing pots with more force than necessary, trying to drown the small, insistent voice in the back of her mind that whispered she had already been seen, already been noticed, already been marked as someone who did not quite belong among the other maids. She had come to Ashford Hall to vanish. Instead, without meaning to, without wanting to, she had already begun to be found. Edmund Gray found her 3 days later in the linen room, folding sheets with the kind of precision that came from years of discipline rather than years of scrubbing floors. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, and Myra felt his presence before she heard it, the way a person feels a storm coming before the first raindrop falls. "You read quickly," he said. Myra did not look up from the sheets. "I do not understand, sir." "In the study, the day it rained." He stepped further into the room, closing the door partway behind him, and something about the careful way he did it made Myra's pulse quicken. "You looked at those pages for perhaps 4 seconds. Most people would need an hour to see what you saw in 4 seconds. I know, because I have spent every night this week trying to see it myself." Myra set down the sheet she was folding and finally met his eyes. There was no point pretending anymore. Not with this man, not with the way he was looking at her, like a predator that had already decided its next move and was simply enjoying the moment before it struck. "I did not see anything, sir," she said carefully. "I am only a maid." "You are a great many things," Edmund said, moving closer, "but I do not believe maid is one of them. Not really. Not underneath." He tilted his head, studying her the way one studies a puzzle box, searching for the hidden latch. Where did a kitchen girl learn to read a ledger the way a banker reads it? Where did she learn to spot a discrepancy of nearly £11,000 without so much as touching a pen? Myra's blood went cold, but she kept her face still. £11,000, so it was real. Whatever mismatch she had noticed in that brief glance was not a trick of the light or a misremembered figure. It was a genuine, staggering theft, hidden inside the columns of a duke's accounts. And Edmund Gray, apparently, knew exactly how much was missing, down to the pound. "I do not know what you mean," Myra said. "Do not insult me," Edmund replied, his voice dropping lower, losing whatever pretense of politeness it had carried. "I have been the steward of this estate for 6 years. I know every servant who has passed through these halls, and I know when someone does not belong among them. You arrived with no references anyone can verify, no family anyone has heard of, and hands too soft for someone who claims to have scrubbed floors her whole life. You are hiding something, girl, and I intend to find out what." "Then find out," Myra said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "I have nothing to tell you." Edmund's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "We shall see." He turned to leave, then paused at the door, glancing back at her with an expression that made her stomach twist. A word of advice. Whatever you saw in that study, forget it. Some numbers are dangerous to remember. He left, and Myra stood alone in the linen room for a long time afterward, her hands trembling in a way she had not allowed them to tremble in front of him. She understood now, with a clarity that frightened her, exactly what she had stumbled into. Edmund Gray was stealing from the estate, slowly, carefully, in amounts small enough to avoid suspicion but large enough over years to build a private fortune. And she, without meaning to, had seen the seams of it in a single glance across an open ledger. The wise thing to do, the safe thing, the thing that matched her entire purpose in coming to Ashford Hall, was to say nothing, to keep scrubbing pots, to let the numbers fade from her memory the way Edmund had suggested, and to remain exactly what she appeared to be. A girl with no name worth remembering, doing work nobody looked twice at. But something in her refused to let it go. Perhaps it was her father's voice in her memory, the way he used to say that numbers never lied, only the people who arranged them did. Perhaps it was simply that she was tired, so deeply tired of disappearing. That evening at dinner in the servants' hall, one of the other kitchen maids, a sharp-tongued girl named Charlotte Vane, made a show of knocking a jug of water directly into Myra's lap, laughing as though it were an accident, though the smirk on her face said otherwise. "Oh dear," Charlotte said, not sounding sorry at all. "I suppose some of us were simply not raised to be careful with our hands." The other maids at the table snickered. Myra stood, water dripping from her apron, and said nothing, only excused herself to change, her jaw tight with the effort of staying calm. Charlotte had disliked her from the very first day, for reasons Myra had never fully understood, though she suspected it had something to do with the way Peter, the young footman, had taken to seeking Myra out during his breaks, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the other maids who had once had his attention. Small cruelties like this had become part of her daily life, and she had learned to absorb them the way stone absorbs rain, without visible damage, without complaint. But that night, changing into her spare dress in the cramped room she shared with 3 others, she found herself crying quietly for the first time in weeks, not because of the spilled water, not really, but because of everything underneath it. The exhaustion, the fear of Edmund Gray's knowing eyes, the weight of pretending, every single hour of every single day, to be someone smaller than she was. She wiped her face, folded the wet dress, and told herself she would not cry again. Crying did not fix ledgers or hide secrets or make Edmund Gray forget what he suspected. The following week brought preparations for a grand event, a gathering of the county's most prominent families to celebrate the anniversary of the Duke's mother, a tradition that had continued each year since her passing. The entire household buzzed with activity. Extra staff were brought in from the village. The kitchens worked through the night preparing dishes that would feed nearly 200 guests. Myra found herself pulled from her usual duties and assigned, along with several other maids, to help prepare the grand terrace where much of the evening's festivities would take place. It was there, stringing lanterns along the stone railing under the darkening sky, that she saw the Duke again, closer than she had been since the day in the study. He was standing at the far end of the terrace, alone, looking out over the gardens with an expression that seemed, for the first time since she had arrived at Ashford Hall, less like a man carved from stone and more like a man carrying something heavy that he had no intention of setting down in front of anyone. Myra should have kept working. She should have finished the lanterns and returned to the kitchen, invisible as always. Instead, something about the stillness of him, the way he stood as though the entire estate's weight rested on his shoulders alone, made her pause. "The stars will be clear tonight," she said, before she could stop herself, gesturing toward the darkening sky where the first pale points of light were beginning to appear. "No clouds for miles." The Duke turned, surprised, as though he had forgotten anyone else was on the terrace at all. His eyes found hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You take an interest in the stars," he said finally, not quite a question. "Everyone can look at them, my lord," Myra said carefully, already regretting having spoken at all. "It does not require permission." Something flickered across his face, amusement perhaps, or curiosity, though it was gone before she could be certain. "No," he agreed slowly, "it does not." He looked as though he might say something further, but the housekeeper's voice rang out from the doorway, calling for more staff in the kitchen, and the moment dissolved as quickly as it had formed. Myra dropped a quick curtsy and hurried away, her heart beating faster than the brief exchange should have warranted. She told herself it meant nothing. A duke and a maid exchanging a handful of words about the weather. It happened every day in every great house across the country. There was nothing remarkable about it. And yet she found herself thinking about it long after the lanterns were finished, long after the kitchen work was done, long after she should have been asleep. The night of the celebration arrived with a golden sunset that stretched long shadows across the lawns. Carriages began arriving before dusk, spilling out lords and ladies in silks and jewels, their laughter carrying across the gravel drive. Myra, along with the other maids, was kept busy carrying trays, refilling glasses, and moving quickly and quietly through rooms full of people who barely seemed to notice the staff at all, treating them as little more than furniture that happened to move. It was during one such moment, carrying a tray of delicate glasses through the crowded ballroom, that Edmund Gray appeared at her side, his hand closing around her arm with a grip too firm to be casual. "A word," he said quietly, steering her toward a quieter corner near the tall windows. "I have thought further on our conversation." "I have nothing more to say to you," Myra said, trying to pull free without causing a scene. "You will listen anyway." Edmund's voice was low, urgent, and something in his eyes had shifted since their last conversation, a desperation that had not been there before. "I know you saw the numbers. I know you understand what they mean. What I do not yet know is what you intend to do with that knowledge." "I intend to do nothing," Myra said. "I told you that already." "Words are easy," Edmund said, "but I have seen the way the Duke watches you now. Do not think I have not noticed. If you say one word to him, one single word about what you saw, I promise you, you will regret it far more than I will." Before Myra could respond, a burst of laughter erupted from across the ballroom, and Edmund straightened, releasing her arm and stepping back with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years hiding things in plain sight. He melted into the crowd without another word, leaving Myra standing alone near the windows, her arm aching where his fingers had gripped it, her mind racing. She set down her tray on a side table, needing a moment to steady herself, and it was then that she noticed the terrace doors standing open, the night air drifting in cool and welcome against the heat of the crowded room. She slipped outside without thinking, desperate for a breath of air that did not carry the smell of perfume and wine and threat all tangled together. The terrace was empty, the party's noise muffled behind her, the sky above spread out in a wide, dark canvas scattered with stars. Myra walked to the railing and gripped it with both hands, breathing slowly, trying to steady the pounding of her heart. Above her, the stars wheeled in their familiar, ancient patterns, patterns she had known since she was a child small enough to sit on her father's shoulders while he pointed out each constellation by name. She found herself whispering them now, quietly, a habit from another life, a comfort she had not realized she still needed. She did not hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late to compose herself. "You know their names." Myra turned quickly, startled, to find the Duke standing a few feet away, his coat unbuttoned, his expression unreadable in the dim light spilling from the ballroom windows. She had not heard him approach, too lost in her own whispered recitation to notice. "My lord," she said, straightening quickly, smoothing her apron with hands that were not quite steady. "Forgive me, I did not mean to wander so far from my duties." "You were nomming the stars," he said, ignoring her apology entirely, stepping closer to the railing beside her. In more than one language, unless I am mistaken. Myra's stomach dropped. She had not even realized she had slipped between languages, the way she used to as a child, French for the summer constellations, Italian for the ones her mother had loved best, the private tongue her father had invented for the two of them, half nonsense, half genuine astronomy, spoken only between father and daughter on quiet rooftop nights. "I do not know what you mean, my lord," she said, though the lie felt thin even as she spoke it. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and this time there was no mistaking the sharpness in his gaze. The way a man looks when a puzzle he has been turning over for weeks finally begins to show its edges. "That star," he said, pointing toward a bright point low on the horizon, "what do you call it?" Myra hesitated. She could lie. She could claim ignorance, plead exhaustion, excuse herself back to the party and the safety of invisibility. It would be the wise thing to do. It would be the safe thing to do. Instead, something in her, something worn thin by weeks of silence and threats and small cruelties, simply gave way. "My father called it the shepherd's friend," she said quietly, "because it rises just before dawn, when a shepherd needs to know it is nearly time to gather the flock before the heat of the day. In the old astronomers' charts it has a longer name, one most people have forgotten. My mother used to say it looked lonely, hanging there all by itself while the rest of its neighbors were still hidden." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Myra began to regret every word. "That is not the answer of a kitchen maid," the Duke said finally. "No," Myra admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is not." He turned to face her fully now, and there was something almost gentle in the way he studied her. None of the coldness the other servants whispered about, none of the sharp judgment she had braced herself for. "Who are you?" he asked. "Truly." Myra's throat tightened. She thought of Edmund Gray's grip on her arm, his warning still fresh, and of the letter hidden beneath her floorboard, and of everything she had worked so hard to bury since the day her old life had been taken apart. "I am no one, my lord," she said finally, "no one worth remembering." She turned and walked back toward the ballroom before he could respond, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it, leaving him standing alone at the railing beneath a sky full of names only she seemed to know. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Myra threw herself back into her duties with a kind of desperate focus, refilling glasses, clearing plates, avoiding both Edmund Gray's watchful eyes and the Duke's occasional, searching glances from across the crowded room. By the time the last guests departed and the staff began the exhausting work of clearing the ballroom, she was so tired she could barely stand, and grateful for it, because exhaustion left no room for thinking. It was well past midnight when she finally climbed the narrow servants' staircase toward her room, her feet aching, her mind still turning over everything that had happened. She was so lost in thought that she nearly did not notice the folded paper slipped beneath her door until she nearly stepped on it. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she recognized instantly, handwriting she had not seen in over a year, handwriting that belonged to a world she thought she had left behind for good. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The wax seal, though cracked and hastily applied, bore a mark she knew as well as her own face in a mirror, a mark that meant the past she had run so far to escape had somehow found her, even here, even in this quiet corner of the countryside where nobody was supposed to know her name. She sat down heavily on the edge of her narrow bed, the letter unopened in her lap, and for a long moment she simply stared at it, afraid of what it might contain, afraid of what it meant that it had found her at all. Outside her small window, the party's last lantern still glowed faintly along the terrace, and somewhere beyond them, the stars continued their slow, indifferent wheel across the sky, the same stars she had named for a duke who was not supposed to matter to her at all, and yet somehow, impossibly, already did. She broke the seal. The letter was short, shorter than she expected given how long it had taken to find her, and the words on the page made her blood run cold. It was not from her mother, as she had first hoped in some small, foolish corner of her heart. It was from a man named Cassius Bell, a solicitor who had once managed her family's affairs before everything collapsed, and his message was simple and devastating in its brevity. They have found where you were sent. They know the name you are using now. You have perhaps a fortnight before they arrive. Trust no one within those walls, not even the ones who seem kind. Myra read it 3 times before the meaning fully settled into her chest, cold and heavy as a stone dropped into still water. Someone knew where she was. Someone was coming. And the warning to trust no one, not even the kind ones, sat uneasily beside the memory of the Duke's face on the terrace, the way he had looked at her as though she were something worth understanding rather than something to be used or discarded. She folded the letter carefully and slid it beneath the loose floorboard alongside her mother's, her hand steady now, though her heart was anything but. Whatever softness had begun to creep into her days at Ashford Hall, whatever fragile sense of safety she had allowed herself to build brick by brick over these past weeks, she understood now that it could not last. Somewhere out there, in a world she thought she had left behind, the past was moving toward her again, patient and certain as the turning of the stars themselves. And this time, she was not at all certain she would be able to outrun it. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, it was thin and restless, filled with half-formed memories of her father's study, of men in dark coats pounding on a door that would not hold, of her mother's voice calling her name from somewhere she could never quite reach. She woke before dawn, heart racing, and lay still in the darkness listening to the breathing of the other maids around her, grateful, at least, that none of them stirred. The days that followed carried a strange, doubled quality, as though she were living 2 lives at once. On the surface, she remained exactly what she had always pretended to be, a quiet, hard-working maid who kept her head down and her hands busy. Beneath that surface, every moment was consumed with counting days, calculating how much time remained before the fortnight in Cassius Bell's letter ran out, and turning over, again and again, the question of what she would do when it did. Edmund Gray watched her more closely than ever, his suspicion sharpening with each passing day, though he made no further direct threats. Instead, he seemed to be waiting, patient as a spider at the edge of its web, for some misstep that would confirm whatever he already believed about her. The Duke, for his part, seemed equally changed, though in a different direction entirely. Where before he had passed her in the halls without a glance, now his eyes found her more often than seemed accidental, lingering a moment too long before he caught himself and looked away. Twice he found reasons to speak with her directly, brief exchanges about nothing of consequence, the weather, the state of the gardens, whether the new arrangement of the library shelves suited the staff who had to clean them. Small things. Ordinary things. And yet each conversation left Myra unsettled in a way she could not quite name, as though something in her carefully constructed walls had begun, without her permission, to crack. It was nearly a week after the celebration when everything came apart at once. Myra had been sent to deliver a message to the stables, a rare errand that took her outside the main house and across the wide lawns as the afternoon sun slanted low and golden over the grounds. She was halfway across the gravel path when she heard raised voices coming from behind the old carriage house, sharp and urgent enough that she slowed without meaning to, some old instinct pulling her toward the sound rather than away from it. She recognized Edmund Gray's voice first, low and furious, followed by another voice she did not recognize at all, a stranger's voice, rough and impatient. "You said she would be dealt with by now," the stranger snapped. "That was the arrangement. I did not travel 2 days to be told excuses." "These things take time," Edmund replied, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "The girl is careful. If I move too quickly, the Duke will grow suspicious, and then everything unravels, not just for me, for you as well, and for whoever is paying you to ask these questions." Myra's blood turned to ice. She pressed herself flat against the stone wall of the carriage house, barely breathing, straining to hear more. "My employer grows impatient," the stranger said. "He wants to know if the girl truly is who we believe her to be, and if so, what she knows about her family's old dealings before everything fell apart. There is money owed, money that vanished along with her father, and my employer intends to collect it, one way or another." "I have told you," Edmund hissed. "I do not care about your employer's money. I care about the number she saw in that ledger. If she speaks to the Duke about what she found, my own arrangement here collapses, and I have far more to lose than some old family debt." "Then perhaps our interests align," the stranger said, his tone shifting, turning almost amused. "You want her silenced for your reasons. My employer wants her found for his. It seems a simple enough problem to solve, does it not?" Myra did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked away as quickly and quietly as she could manage, her mind racing faster than her feet, the stable errand entirely forgotten. Two separate dangers, tangled together now into one, closing in on her from directions she had not even considered. Edmund Gray wanted her silent because of what she knew about his theft. And somewhere, a man she had never met wanted her found because of debts tied to her father, debts she had known nothing about, debts that apparently still followed her family's name like a shadow that refused to fade. She made it back to the kitchen in a daze, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the tray she was meant to be carrying. Peter noticed immediately, his kind face creasing with concern. "Myra, what is wrong? You look as though you have seen a ghost." "I am fine," she said, forcing the words out through a throat gone tight with fear. "Only tired." Peter did not look convinced, but before he could press further, Mrs. Whitfield's voice cut through the kitchen, summoning Myra to the front hall, where, she was told, the Duke wished to speak with her directly. Myra's stomach dropped further still. There was no good reason for a Duke to summon a kitchen maid to speak with him privately, and in her current state, with her nerves already stretched thin as glass, she was not at all certain she could maintain the careful walls she had built around herself for so many weeks. She found him in the study, the same room where all of this had begun, standing near the window with his back to the door, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the scattered papers on his desk. "You wish to see me, my lord," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. He turned, and something in his expression made her chest tighten further, a mixture of concern and determination that she had not seen from him before. "I have been going through the estate's accounts more carefully these past days," he said. "Ever since our conversation on the terrace made me realize how little I truly understood about my own household's finances. I have found discrepancies, Myra, significant ones, and I believe you already know exactly what I am talking about." Myra's heart pounded. She could deny it. She could plead ignorance, retreat back into the careful smallness that had kept her safe for weeks. But standing there, exhausted, frightened, with two separate threats closing in around her from opposite directions, she found she simply did not have the strength left to keep pretending. "My lord," she said slowly, "there is a great deal you do not know about me, about why I am here, about what I saw in this room weeks ago, and about the danger that knowledge has placed me in." The Duke's expression sharpened, though not with anger, with something closer to resolve. "Then tell me," he said, "all of it. I find I am rather tired of half-truths in my own house." And so, standing in the fatting afternoon light, with her hands finally steady for the first time in days, Myra began, at last, to speak. She told him everything, or nearly everything, the words coming slowly at first and then faster, as though a dam long held shut had finally given way. She told him of her father, a merchant and scholar who had built a modest fortune through careful trade, and had spent much of it instead on educating his only daughter, hearing tutors from 4 different countries, teaching her himself on quiet evenings when the tutors had gone home, filling her mind with languages and mathematics and the slow, patient movements of the stars. She told him of the winter everything changed, when her father's business partner vanished with funds that were never fully accounted for, leaving behind debts that fell, unfairly and completely, onto her father's shoulders. She told him of the men who came asking for money that no longer existed, of the slow unraveling of a household that had once been full of books and laughter, of her father's illness, brought on, the physician said, by worry and shame in equal measure, and of his death less than a year later, leaving Myra and her mother with nothing but debts and a name that had become a liability rather than an asset. She told him of her mother's decision to send her away under a different name, to disappear into service in a household far from anyone who might recognize her, until enough time had passed and enough debts had faded from memory that she might safely return to whatever life remained for her. She told him of the letter that had found her anyway, delivered by a solicitor named Cassius Bell, warning that the past had located her sooner than anyone had hoped. And finally, her voice dropping lower, she told him what she had overheard that very afternoon behind the carriage house, Edmund Gray's voice tangled together with a stranger's, two separate threats converging on her from opposite directions, one wanting her silent, the other wanting her found. When she finished, the study had gone entirely silent except for the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. The Duke had not interrupted her once, had simply listened, his expression shifting through concern and something that looked unmistakably like anger, though she understood quickly enough that the anger was not directed at her. "Edmund Gray," he said finally, his voice low and controlled in the way of a man forcing himself to remain calm. "My own steward, stealing from this estate for years and threatening a member of my household to keep it hidden." "I did not want to burden you with any of this," Myra said quietly. "I only wanted to disappear quietly, to bring no trouble to your house." "You have brought no trouble," the Duke said, more gently than she expected. "Edmund Gray has brought trouble through his own greed and cowardice. You have brought nothing but the truth, which I find myself rather grateful for, even under these circumstances." Myra felt something loosen in her chest, some knot she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was possible to breathe without it. But the relief was brief, chased quickly by the memory of the stranger's voice behind the carriage house and the fortnight that was ticking steadily down toward its end. "There is still the matter of the man Edmund was speaking with," she said. "Someone sent by whoever now holds my father's old debts. I do not know how much time remains before they come for me directly." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Then we shall simply have to ensure they find nothing worth taking when they arrive." Over the following days, the household at Ashford Hall shifted in ways the other servants noticed, but did not fully understand. The Duke began spending long hours closeted in the study with his solicitor, a careful, precise man summoned from London who spent 2 full days reviewing every ledger, every account, every transaction Edmund Gray had overseen during his 6 years as steward. Myra, though she said nothing to the other maids, found herself called upon more than once to help clarify a column of figures or confirm a discrepancy her sharp eyes had caught weeks earlier. Her presence in the study, no longer something she needed to hide, though she remained careful, out of old habit, to keep her voice low and her manner unassuming whenever other servants might overhear. Edmund Gray, for his part, grew increasingly agitated as the days passed, though he seemed unable to determine exactly how much the Duke had discovered or how much danger he was truly in. He avoided Myra entirely now, no longer bothering with threats or warnings, though she caught him watching her sometimes from across the courtyard, his expression unreadable in a way that unsettled her more than his earlier hostility ever had. Charlotte Vane, oblivious to the deeper currents moving beneath the household's surface, continued her small cruelties whenever the opportunity arose, though Myra found she had little energy left to be wounded by spilled water or muttered insults when far greater dangers loomed on the horizon. Peter, sensing something had shifted though not understanding what, took to walking with her during her rare free moments, a quiet, steady presence that Myra found herself grateful for, even as she remained careful not to draw him too deeply into a situation she did not yet fully understand herself. It was on the 9th day after her conversation with the Duke, with only 5 days remaining before the fortnight in Cassius Bell's letter expired, that the household received an unexpected visitor. He arrived without carriage or announcement, walking up the long gravel drive on foot as though he had traveled some distance already, and saw no reason to hide his approach now. Mrs. Whitfield, alarmed by the sight of a stranger approaching the main entrance rather than the servant's door, sent word immediately to the Duke, who received the news with a grim, unsurprised expression, as though he had been expecting exactly this for days. The visitor gave his name as Julian Marsh, and claimed to represent the interests of a gentleman in London to whom, he said, a substantial debt was owed by the family of a girl currently residing at Ashford Hall under an assumed name. He was polite in his manner, disturbingly so, the kind of politeness that felt more like a blade wrapped in silk than any genuine courtesy. The Duke received him in the front hall rather than the study, a deliberate choice, Myra later understood, meant to keep the conversation formal and witnessed rather than private and vulnerable. She stood nearby, summoned at the Duke's request, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the visitor could hear it from across the room. "I believe you have a maid here," Julian Marsh said, his eyes sweeping the assembled staff until they landed, with unnerving precision, directly on Myra, who is not entirely who she claims to be. "I have several maids," the Duke replied evenly, "none of whom are any business of yours unless you can produce a legal claim that would interest a magistrate, rather than simply a story." Julian Marsh's smile did not waver, though something behind his eyes hardened. "The claim is quite legal, I assure you. Debts owed by the girl's late father, transferred through proper channels to my employer. She is, in effect, an asset that has gone missing from an estate settlement, and my employer would very much like that matter resolved." "An asset," the Duke repeated, his voice dropping into something cold and dangerous that Myra had never heard from him before. "You refer to a young woman as an asset." "I refer to legal matter, my lord, nothing more." The Duke stepped forward, and though he did not raise his voice, the authority in his bearing filled the hall more completely than shouting ever could have. "Then you may inform your employer that any debts owed by her father's estate should be directed through my solicitor, who has already reviewed the matter extensively and finds the claim, shall we say, rather questionable in its documentation. You may also inform him that any further attempt to locate or threaten a member of my household will be treated, from this point forward, as a matter for the local magistrate, rather than a private conversation between gentlemen." For the first time since his arrival, Julian Marsh's composure faltered, just slightly, just enough for Myra to see the calculation happening behind his eyes as he weighed the cost of pressing further against a Duke with clear resources and clearer resolve. Whatever conclusion he reached, he kept it to himself, offering only a shallow bow before turning and walking back down the long gravel drive the way he had come, without another word. The hall remained silent for a long moment after he disappeared from view. Myra realized distantly that she had been holding her breath and let it out slowly, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "That will not be the end of it," she said quietly, once the other servants had dispersed back to their duties. "Men like that do not simply give up because a Duke raises his voice." "No," the Duke agreed, his expression grim. "But it buys us time. And time, I find, is exactly what we need to finish dealing with Edmund Gray before he can cause further damage or connect himself further to whoever is chasing you." That evening, alone in her small room, Myra allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to cry without immediately forcing the tears back down. Not from despair this time, but from something closer to relief, mixed with a fear that had not fully faded, mixed with something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for, that had settled quietly into her chest ever since the Duke had stood in that hall and called her, without hesitation, a member of his household rather than a debt to be collected. She did not know, not yet, what any of it meant for what came next, but for the first time since arriving at Ashford Hall, she allowed herself to hope that whatever came next might not require her to disappear again. The final confrontation came sooner than anyone expected, and not in the manner anyone had prepared for. It began with a dinner, a formal affair the Duke had arranged with careful precision, inviting a small circle of the county's more influential families under the pretense of discussing an upcoming charitable fund for the local parish. Among the guests was a visiting scholar named Professor Hale, a man renowned throughout the region for his sharp tongue and his tendency to test anyone he considered beneath his intellectual notice, servants included, with questions designed less to inform than to humiliate. Myra had been assigned, along with several other maids, to assist with serving the meal, a task she performed with the same practiced invisibility she had cultivated over her weeks at Ashford Hall. She kept her eyes low, her movements efficient, and did her best to remain nothing more than a quiet presence at the edge of the room while the guests discussed politics and harvests and the price of grain. It was during the second course that Professor Hale, having consumed rather more wine than good judgment might have advised, turned his attention toward Myra as she refilled his glass, his eyes narrowing with the particular cruelty of a man who enjoyed catching others out. "You," he said, loud enough for the table to quiet and turn toward them. "The Duke tells me you are rather better educated than one might expect from a serving girl. Let us test this claim, shall we?" Myra froze, the wine jug still in her hands, aware of every eye in the room suddenly fixed upon her. The Duke, seated at the head of the table, went very still, his expression tightening, though he said nothing, waiting to see how the moment would unfold. Professor Hale switched languages without warning, addressing her in Greek, a rapid, deliberately obscure question about a minor historical figure, clearly expecting silence, expecting embarrassment, expecting the satisfaction of watching a servant girl stammer and fail in front of an audience of her betters. Myra set down the wine jug carefully, straightened her spine, and answered him fluently in the same language, correcting a small factual error in his question as she did so, her tone polite but unmistakably precise. The table fell into stunned silence. Professor Hale's face reddened, though whether from embarrassment or wine, Myra could not be certain. He tried again, shifting into Latin this time, a more obscure question still, his voice carrying an edge of genuine irritation now rather than mere condescension. Myra answered that too, without hesitation, her voice steady even as her heart pounded against her ribs. "Remarkable," murmured one of the guests, a lady seated near the middle of the table, leaning forward with open curiosity, now rather than the polite disinterest servants usually received. Professor Hale, unwilling to let the matter rest, switched languages twice more, first to French, then to a dialect of Italian so regional that few scholars outside the specific province would have recognized it at all, clearly hoping to finally find the edge of her knowledge and expose it publicly. Myra answered each question in turn, her voice growing steadier with each response, some old, buried part of her rising to the surface after months of forced silence, a part of her that remembered exactly who she had been before debts and disappearance had rewritten her into someone smaller. "Where?" Professor Hale finally demanded, setting down his glass with more force than necessary. "Did a kitchen maid learn 5 languages well enough to correct a professor of classical studies at his own table?" The room waited. Myra felt the Duke's eyes on her, steady and unwavering, offering in his silence a kind of permission she had not realized she needed. "My father believed," she said clearly, her voice carrying now to every corner of the room. That knowledge belonged to whoever was willing to work hard enough to earn it, regardless of what name they carried or what station they were born into. He taught me every language he knew, and paid for tutors to teach me the ones he did not, because he believed a mind once filled could never truly be taken away, no matter what else might be lost. She paused, aware that every eye in the room remained fixed on her, aware that there was no going back now, no retreating into the safe, small invisibility she had maintained for so many weeks. "My name," she continued, "is not truly Myra Sinclair as I have been known here. My name is Miranda Thornwood, daughter of the late Edmund Thornwood, a merchant and scholar whose business partner's betrayal left our family with debts we did not create and could not pay. I came to Ashford Hall under a false name because I had nowhere else safe to go, and because I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that disappearing into service might buy enough time for the debts attached to my father's name to fade before they could catch up with what remained of my family." The silence that followed was absolute. Professor Hale, for once, had nothing clever to say. Several of the guests exchanged glances, murmuring quietly amongst themselves, though whether from scandal or sympathy, Myra could not immediately tell. It was the Duke who broke the silence, rising from his seat at the head of the table with the unhurried certainty that had marked every movement he made since Myra had first seen him step down from his carriage weeks ago. "Miss Thornwood," he said, and something in the way he used her true name, her father's name, restored rather than hidden, made Myra's throat tighten with an emotion she did not have time to fully examine, "has spent recent weeks assisting me in uncovering a significant theft from this estate's accounts, theft that has now been fully documented and will be presented to the magistrate within the week. Her knowledge, her honesty, and her considerable education have been of far greater value to this household than any debt attached to her father's unfortunate business dealings could ever diminish." He turned toward the assembled guests, his voice hardening slightly. "I would also add, for the benefit of anyone who might consider spreading unkind rumors about her circumstances, that Miss Thornwood's father was the victim of fraud, not the perpetrator of it, and that I personally intend to see her family's name restored to whatever standing it deserves, beginning with tonight." The dinner resumed eventually, though the conversation carried a very different energy than it had before, curiosity replacing condescension, several guests going out of their way to address Myra, or rather Miranda, directly, asking about her studies, her father's collection of books, her thoughts on subjects they would never have thought to raise with a serving girl an hour earlier. The reckoning with Edmund Gray came 2 days later, swift and thorough, once the Duke's solicitor had finished compiling the full extent of the theft, nearly £14,000 accumulated over 6 years through careful, patient dishonesty. Edmund was dismissed from his position immediately, the full evidence of his crimes handed over to the local magistrate, and whatever arrangement he had made with Julian Marsh's employer collapsed entirely once his own legal troubles consumed every ounce of his attention. Julian Marsh himself did not return to Ashford Hall. Though word reached the household weeks later that the debt claim against Miranda's family had been quietly dropped once the Duke's solicitor demonstrated, with documentation Miranda herself had helped assemble from memory, that the original debt had been fraudulently transferred in the first place, a discovery that opened an entirely separate investigation into the man who had originally betrayed her father. For Miranda, the weeks that followed felt like waking from a long, exhausting dream into a life she had almost forgotten was possible. She remained at Ashford Hall, though no longer in the kitchens, instead assisting the Duke's solicitor with the careful work of restoring the estate's accounts to full order, her quick mind and quicker hands finally given room to work the way they had been trained to, rather than forced into hiding beneath an apron and a false name. The Duke sought her out often during those weeks, ostensibly to discuss the accounts, though their conversations rarely stayed confined to numbers for long. They spoke of languages, of the stars, of her father's rooftop lessons and his own childhood spent largely alone in a house too grand and too quiet for a boy who had lost his mother too young. Something steady had grown between them, quiet and unhurried, neither of them rushing to name it, both of them, perhaps, too careful with old wounds to trust something so new too quickly. It was on a clear evening, nearly a month after the dinner that had changed everything, that Miranda found herself once again on the terrace, the same terrace where she had first named the stars for him without meaning to reveal anything at all. The Duke joined her there, as she had somehow known he would, standing beside her at the railing while the sky deepened into its familiar scatter of light. "You never finished," he said quietly, "telling me the name of that star, the shepherd's friend." Miranda smiled, the first easy smile she had allowed herself in longer than she could remember. "I told you everything that mattered." "Did you?" He turned to face her, and there was something in his expression, careful and searching, that made her heart beat faster than any question of astronomy ever could. "I find myself wanting to know a great many things about you still, Miranda Thornwood, more than the stars can tell me." She did not answer right away, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them, the way silence only stretches comfortably between two people who have already decided, without saying so, that they intend to have many more evenings just like this one. "Then ask," she said finally, "and I promise this time I will not hide the answer." Above them, the stars continued their slow, patient wheel across the sky, indifferent as always to the small, significant things unfolding beneath them, though Miranda, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt entirely certain that whatever came next, she would not have to face it alone, and would not have to disappear to survive it.